Yerba mate versus green tea. They both have caffeine, they both energize you. Candidly, they're both great, but we don't know the entire mechanisms as to why one could be better than the other. But what we do have is lots and lots of data. So we're gonna break down the difference between green tea and yerba mate, decide which one's better for what, but also give you a playbook on when to use one or the other, because they seem to, when you unpack all the literature, have very different uses. Start with yerba mate, and then we'll move into green tea, and then we'll sort of overlay which one works best for what. The first thing I want to talk about with yerba mate is how it can enhance fat burning, but also how it can enhance exercise, and double that, fat burning during exercise. So there was a study published in Nutrition and Metabolism. Really fascinating study, and I like it because they gave subjects 1,000 milligrams of yerba mate, pretty serious amount, or placebo prior to exercise, so 60 minutes prior to exercise. And then what they had them do is they had them go on like a stationary bike or a treadmill, some form of ergometer. And they would have them increase their intensity by 0.5 watts per kilogram, right? Every 3 minutes. So it was almost structured like a VO2 max test where they got on a bike and then they'd increase intensity every 3 minutes by a small amount based on their weight, which makes it very accurate. What they found with this is that yerba mate increased the total energy expenditure, but also the fatty acid utilization at all intensities up until 70% maximum intensity by, get this, 24%. A 24% increase in fat utilization and energy expenditure, as long as the intensity wasn't going above 70%. Once it got above 70%, it started to come down. Why is that? Well, once you get above 70%, you're starting to be more glycolytic. You're using more carbs. And it seems as though yerba mate helps encourage fat utilization and ends up increasing the energy expenditure from fat. Now, this is really cool, but there also seemed to be a benefit at higher intensities too. Above 70%, actually in all ranges, there was a decrease in blood lactate levels. Decreases in blood lactate means you were probably getting less of those hydrogen ions, creating an acidic environment, ultimately being less of a burn-like feeling, meaning you were probably able to push a little bit harder. Okay, move into the next piece, specifically for weight loss with yerba mate. Okay, so yerba mate, we know can help you oxidize fat more during exercise, but let's look when we're actually looking at body composition. So this study was published in BMC Complementary Medicine and Therapies. Very fascinating stuff. They gave subjects yerba mate or a placebo for 12 weeks. They saw a very significant body composition change. They saw a reduction in total body fat mass, a reduction in body fat percentage, and a change in their waist to hip ratio that was statistically significant. Why does this occur? Well, we can dive into the other mechanistic literature, but ultimately we find that it increases, once again, fat oxidation, which you've seen with this literature. When the waist to hip ratio changes, basically they're maintaining muscle and burning more fat. Now, why would this happen? Well, if the body becomes stronger at utilizing fat, develops a stronger affinity for using fat, it has less chance of actually having to deaminate and break down amino acids for gluconeogenesis. It's going to become much more efficient at just utilizing fat for fuel, and that itself is actually quite muscle sparing. So anyhow, more literature needs to be published to really say definitely, but it looks promising. Now, another potential reason that people might lose weight when they use yerba mate tea or drink it is something that has to do with the metabolic side and our blood glucose. With this, we turn to a study published in the journal, the American Nutrition Association. Again, pretty fascinating. In this particular case, they took subjects that were either diabetic, pre-diabetic, or even insulin resistant. It reduced their LDL and it reduced their triglycerides. Why again is this happening? Okay, on one side, it could simply be the caffeine, mobilizing more fats and thereby decreasing the need to utilize glucose so much. But what's interesting is in pre-diabetics, there was an even more significant reduction in LDL and triglycerides. What this demonstrates to us is that in a healthy individual, it is helping fat oxidation more. When triglycerides go down, a lot of times it means that you're taking the fatty acids off of the glycerol backbone. A triglyceride is a glycerol and 3 fatty acids, tri, glyceride. Okay, so it breaks apart those fatty acids off of the glycerol, and then you're using those fatty acids for fuel. So when you see a reduction in triglycerides without a huge dietary change, it does help us understand that maybe it's helping us use fats better. This can impact all kinds of different metabolic parameters through multiple different avenues. Now with that, there is another study that demonstrates that yerba mate might be cardioprotective. It was published in Nutrición Hospitalaria, and what they found in this study is that when they gave subjects yerba mate, there was not only a significant reduction in LDL, but there was a 10 milligram per deciliter decrease in their triglycerides. So I know this kind of overlaps some of the other literature, but when you're putting it specifically in a cardioprotective state, it's kind of interesting. But caffeine could be cardioprotective too. So are all these benefits coming from caffeine? Possibly, but more research needs to be done. Now let's talk a drawback really quick. The major drawback of the yerba mate is the caffeine content. There was a study published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine that demonstrated that when caffeine was consumed in amounts that you would get with yerba mate within 6 hours of bed, it could have such a deleterious effect on your sleep that it could effectively erase 1 hour of your sleep. So what is the idea here? The idea here is do not take it like afternoon. Definitely don't take it within 6 hours of bed. The earlier in the day, the better. Okay, we're gonna pivot. We're gonna talk green tea for a second, and then we're gonna come back and we're gonna talk when you should be consuming what tea. First off, let's compare green tea in the exercise world and the fat loss world for just a second to yerba mate. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition published a similar paper to the one that was published in Nutrition and Metabolism for yerba mate, but this time for green tea. So they had subjects consume green tea extract 60 minutes prior to exercise. In this case, it was 30 minutes at 60% of their max intensity. In this case, the green tea increased fat oxidation and energy expenditure 17%. If you recall, yerba mate was 24%. That's actually a pretty negligible difference, but over the long haul, it does add up more. Yerba mate seems to be slightly better at increasing fat oxidation. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. Here's where green tea seems to shine. There is literature strongly supporting green tea for longevity. Now, this study was published in JAMA, J-A-M-A, looked at 40,000 people plus between the ages of 40 and 79, okay, and with an 11-year follow-up. Essentially what they found is that the more green tea consumption, those that consumed 5 cups of green tea, we're not talking like venti Starbucks cups, we're talking like a regular, Japanese style cups, right? So 5 or so cups of green tea per day had a significantly less chance of dying. In fact, we're talking a 12 to 23% less risk of death during the actual study period. The risk of dying from heart disease was reduced by 31% in women and 22% in men. So huge reductions. And this, I know, is somewhat associative, it's correlative, but this is large data. And the people that seem to drink green tea seem to overall be healthier, even if it's just a decision that they make that also just reflected other decisions they make, they were healthier. But get this, it reduced stroke risk from 35 to 42%. That is a huge reduction in stroke risk. And it lines up with some of the other stuff we've seen with like fat oxidation. Maybe it's increasing fat utilization, decreasing arterial plaque. Who knows, right? The bottom line is it seems to be highly, highly associated with longevity. Now, in addition to this, there's strong evidence, as published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition with 14 trials over 1,100 participants, that green tea is very good at lowering cholesterol. So what this study demonstrated is that those that consume green tea, the green tea group or just the more green tea that was consumed, reduced total cholesterol by 7 milligrams per deciliter and on average reduced LDL by 2 milligrams per deciliter. I know it doesn't sound like a ton, but we're talking without dietary intervention here. We're talking just with having green tea in the diet. Again, why does it do this? I think it comes back right to A, caffeine, increasing cyclic adenosine monophosphate and also liberating more fats, increasing lipolysis, perhaps getting the body more accustomed to utilizing fats. Flat out also, for whatever reason, maybe the catechins, because we're finding more evidence with the catechins being supportive of muscle mass. More muscle equals more fat utilization equals better glucose levels. There's a lot of cardiometabolic pieces we could look at. And lastly, there's evidence from a neuroprotective side that we didn't really realize with green tea before. Now, this study is interesting. It was published in Translational Psychiatry. It is in vitro. It took a look at PC12 cells, which come from the adrenal medulla. What they found with this is that these PC12 cells, when exposed to hydrogen peroxide to induce basically a lot of oxidative stress, they would die. They would go through apoptosis. But green tea reversed this. It reversed the apoptosis, it increased the survivability, and it increased the proliferation. So the cells were able to actually reproduce and do what they're supposed to do. This shows that it could be strongly neuroprotective. The only drawback that we've seen with green tea, aside from, of course, the caffeine, is there's a lot of evidence that it causes heartburn and digestive upset. So like on an empty stomach, green tea might cause some heartburn. It might make you feel uncomfortable, and that's a very real thing. But let's talk about when to apply what. Since we notice that Yerba Mate seems to have benefit with intensities a little bit higher when it comes to exercise, it might be best to take Yerba Mate only a couple days per week on the days that maybe you're doing more high intensity training. Because of the improvements that you can have with lactate, reducing lactate, it might allow you to push a little bit harder. But my concern with taking too much Yerba Mate is that it's so high in caffeine that you might end up developing a tolerance to it, and maybe you're gonna have a reduced impact. So take it a couple days per week on the days when you have a higher intensity. I don't think you're gonna get a huge benefit above like 80%, 90% intensity, but if you're sitting, let's say you're doing like high intensity intervals like battle ropes, Metcon kind of thing, Yerba Mate could be your best friend that day. Whereas green tea, a little bit lower key, it might be better to use during your lower intensity zone 2 type work, like going out for a ruck or maybe going for a slow jog. What I do is when I'm rucking, I will a lot of times drink green tea in the morning. It's actually a nice way for me to enjoy my cup of green tea while I'm also getting, an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours even if I'm training for something with these longer rucks. I just sip on green tea. The catechins are also, there's newer evidence out of Dr. Andy Galpin's lab here in 2024 that demonstrates that green tea might be muscle preserving. The catechins have a muscle preservation effect, so it might literally help you build muscle because it's decreasing that muscle protein breakdown. Green tea is something that you're safer to sip on throughout the course of the day. It has the theanine that counterbalances some of the caffeine, and clearly we're seeing with the longevity aspect that it's going to be really, really good to take in over the long haul. So as long as it's not impacting your sleep and your sleep is still your priority, sipping on green tea throughout the course of the day in small amounts or taking green tea extract could be really, really, really good from the longevity perspective. When I would not use Yerba Mate is when you're just doing like a low intensity exercise or when you're trying to say be sedentary and you just want the caffeine hit, right? Do not use it for that. It really seems to shine with movement. Yerba Mate seems to be good for that. And although you might get a head buzz from it and you might feel alive, in some ways it's a waste. Green tea is much better for the cognitive aspect, especially as we've seen with those PC12 cells, even though that's in vitro. So sitting down, like working, green tea makes more sense. And then when you're ready to get active, it makes more sense to have the Yerba Mate. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.